Welcome to the deep dive. Get ready, because we're diving into a stack of sources all about the fascinating island nation of Fiji.
That's right. We have academic papers, historical excerpts, research, quite a collection, really.
Yeah, a whole collection covering Fiji's geography, history, culture, economy, challenges.
And even looking towards the future, all provided by you.
And our mission for this deep dive is, well, pretty straightforward. We're going to go through these sources together. We'll unpack the most important insights, maybe some surprising details.
Yeah, pull out the key stuff.
Exactly, and give you a solid understanding of Fiji based only on these documents we have in front of us.
Fiji, over 300 islands, Southwest Pacific. It's often called a natural stepping stone.
Right. So let's see what secrets these particular sources hold about this archipelago.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with the scene. The sources set, Fiji's geography, the environment.
Right, the basics. Location first, Southwest Pacific.
Yeah, they give coordinates roughly 14 to 20 degrees south, extending east and west around the 180 longitude line.
Puts it southwest of Hawaii. About 2,000 miles from San Francisco, one source notes.
And it's immediately clear it's complex geographically, not just, two big islands.
No, definitely not. You've got Viti Levu and Vanua Levu, the main volcanic ones, sure.
But then there are these smaller groups mentioned.
Exactly. The Lau Islands out east, Lomiviti sort of in the middle, and the Asawas up northwest.
And they even point out specific volcanic features like the Nandi and Suva peninsulas.
Tavuni Island, Mount Korobaba near Suva, which apparently rises quite dramatically from the coast.
Okay, and what about the climate? What picture do the sources paint?
Well, it's described as tropical maritime. You get short electrical storms, distinct wet and dry seasons.
Right, and those prevailing southeast trade winds are mentioned.
Yeah, pretty important. They also note it's in a cyclone area. Usually the cyclones form northwest of the islands.
Any specifics on temperature or rain?
Average temps hover around 25 Celsius, maybe dipping to 23 in July, August.
Okay.
Rainfall, though, varies a lot. Nadi on the drier west coast gets about 2,700 millimeters a year.
Compared to
Suva on the east coast, which gets much more, around 3,500 millimeters. Big difference.
Wow, yeah. And ecologically, any vivid details in there?
Oh, definitely. They talk about coral reefs with specific algae, different kinds of mangroves, vata, which are tall reeds, and ninai, more like bush mangroves.
Interesting.
And these vine woods called vinota that apparently can actually strangle trees.
Really?
Yeah. And higher up, you find dense, sort of gloomy woods and areas with warrior bamboos.
Warrior bamboos.
That's the term used. And interestingly, some reef areas apparently have very little woody vegetation.
And signs of life?
Glimpses, yeah. Solitary fishers are mentioned, and goats and pigs found in the bush areas.
Now, there's one source, B. Wiley, from 1923, gives a more personal take.
That's right. Spent time on Viti Levu, studied around Suva and Makaluva Island. Coral reefs, coastal plants. Yeah. Took trips into cultivated areas, but also the wild parts.
And this source gives the less picturesque details, too.
Oh, yeah. Wiley mentions bad roads, trackless swamps, leeches, mosquitoes.
Yeah.
The general dampness of dew-wet foliage.
So not exactly a tourist brochure from 1923.
Not at all. It takes a much rougher picture based on that specific historical view.
What's really interesting from that Wiley source, though, is the comparison made with places like Samoa or Tonga.
Yes, that's quite insightful. According to Wiley, Fiji had some distinct advantages back then.
Like what?
A more favorable climate overall, significantly more good agricultural land.
Okay.
And because of its size and higher mountains, some over 6,000 feet, it had potential for more diverse production.
So varied environments.
Exactly. Narrow coastlands, elevated valley plains, extensive mountain areas. It wasn't just another island group. It had this inherent potential that set it apart, at least from that early perspective.
Okay, moving deeper into the past now. Fiji's location. It really was a stepping stone, wasn't it, for migrations from west and east?
Absolutely. From places like the Solomons and Vanuatu in the west, and Tonga, Samoa from the east, is a natural stopover.
And the sources point to the earliest known settlers.
Yes, the Lapita people. Arriving from the west, noted as WI, specifically somewhere between 950 and 600 BC.
And in significant numbers.
Apparently so. One source estimates over 300 individuals initially.
And that same source, C. Martin et al., suggests early Fiji was pretty populous, maybe 10,000 to 15,000 people around 750 BC.
Yeah, that's the estimate given, based on descriptions of Fiji being rich in important crops like taro and yam.
And having this reputation for fertility.
Right, as one of the most fertile equatorial areas, reputedly.
And the sea martin source pushes human impact back even further, maybe before 2500 BP, based on finds on Yadua Island.
Potentially, yes. They mention evidence of resourceful use of coastal life, giant clams, sea urchins, shells, a strategic location.
But things changed over time. The sources track shifts.
Definitely. They mention these landslips and biota changes in plant and animal life.
And sediments linked to human activity over the last 1,300 years or so.
Plus, things like the relatively late arrival of the Komodo dragon.
Wow.
And long-term human impacts on tortoises, giant clams. It points to big changes in the animal life mix.
And this is presented as sort of typical for tropical islands. Chaotic shifts, climate changes.
Yeah, ecology's prone to change, climate oscillations, habitats shrinking, species nearing extinction.
And others finding new ways to invade.
Right. The sources see a kind of modern tipping point now, driven by population growth and invasive species.
Here's a really surprising detail from one of those sources, C. Martin et al., again. The idea that Fijians might have been the last Polynesians to make that long journey.
The 300-year journey, yeah, to a place like Hawaii or New Zealand.
And there's DNA evidence mentioned, suggesting Polynesians are genetically closer to, well, historical groups, sometimes called galley slaves.
Than to the Melanesian people met in New Zealand later on, yes. That's what the source states.
Fascinating. And land use changes are also covered.
Yes. Agricultural land sometimes went back to forest. There's a mention of a peak in cleared land, possibly linked to the Little Ice Age, around 1450 AD.
Evidence like pruned trees suggesting big fires.
Pruned cativa trees, yeah. And that heavy use could make soils unproductive.
And one source, C. Martin et al., again, even suggests Fijians might have been driven out of some areas by famine.
It floats that possibility, yes. A great famine.
And how would they have left? What do the sources suggest?
Options mentioned include these amazing seagoing kauri canoes.
Described as made to last 40 generations.
Incredible, right? Or maybe simpler journeys, just drifting in single island boats.
And culturally, linguistic links.
Definitely noted. Fijian dialects are described as closely related to Polynesian languages.
Making Fiji a linguistic crossroads.
A significant one, according to Kaiser et al.
And finally, one source touches on this. Almost enigmatic quality of Fiji's prehistory, and a cartography puzzle.
Yeah, C. Martin et al. Again, odd names on maps, questions about how historical knowledge gets made, influenced by human desires, anxieties.
Presented as a specific point of intrigue from that text.
Exactly, just one of the many threads in there.
Okay, so this complex prehistory leads us to a major turning point, European contact.
Right, and its impact. The earliest sighting mentioned is Abel Tasman in 1643.
But he apparently passed unnoticed.
Seems so. More impactful was Captain William Bligh's arrival in 1789.
And the sources say early interactions started changing things. Fijians developing paid work.
Yeah, things like beachcombers, cooks, gardeners, seamen, miners even.
Contingent on the labor psychology of uneducated recruits, as one source puts it.
And this expanded as more groups arrived. Sandalwood traders, tragically, enslaved Pacific Islanders.
The whaling industry is mentioned too.
And even Australian wool sheep, according to Leclerc Farrell. A real influx.
And the foreign trade goods?
Yeah.
They had a massive effect.
Truly profound, according to the sources. Resources left by newcomers got integrated into the chiefdoms.
Changing social structures, power dynamics.
Absolutely. Things like axes, iron, stuff pre-European chiefs barely had access to.
Described as irrevocably changing things.
Yeah, one source argues ruling would have been impossible under normal conditions for pre-contact chiefs without these new goods.
But the consequences were often not good.
Often negative, yeah. Conflicts increased, villages were destroyed.
Sandalwood traders overtook many villages.
That's the phrase used, spreading from the west to the Lau Islands.
So what might have started as more amicable contact shifted.
Towards widespread tribute demands and aggressive actions, yes.
Even village appearance changed. With iron, new wood uses.
Right. And resources like pigs, shells, even people, workers, were reallocated.
And practices like deliberate fires destroying crops,
Yeah.
diets changing.
All mentioned. Plus Europeans capturing weapons like bolos, and workers grieving distant relatives they couldn't get to.
Which apparently turned off chief gifts, making traditional systems unsustainable.
That's the argument in one source, yes. The provisioning system broke down.
Traders even took whole villages. Sharing systems fell apart.
It seemed so. But despite all this pressure, the sources suggest the traditional chiefly structure, while battered, didn't completely collapse.
It carefully evaded degeneration.
That's the phrase. But it was altered. New war implements let chiefs grab new territories, fueled existing conflicts.
And circulating slaves provided labor and food.
Yes, and their outcast position, as it's described, was sometimes used to form opposition groups.
So conflicts intensified between chiefs and Fijians versus beachcombers.
Right. One source uses really striking language about the warriors' exposure changing due to foreign beasts of iron and steam.
Highlighting the overwhelming tech difference.
Exactly. And the initial lack of military resistance is seen as seeming fatal.
Leading to exterminations when demands were denied. That's strong language.
It is, but it's in the source. Attempts to maintain structure using Polynesian methods, ACO, weren't adopted by the newcomers.
Now, B. Wiley's 1923 account offers more details on later contact. Sandalwood ships.
Yeah, more than a dozen vessels over 40 years seeking sandalwood.
And Wiley uses that phrase. Harmonies and blood-curdling destruction also came from the white men once.
Evocative, isn't it? Even compares the impact to the First Fleet in Australia, mentions Bass and Flinders.
That same source describes beachcombers planting foreign roots deep among the natives, and has that very vivid, maybe odd detail about natives inflicting beastly torture and Michelin upon cruel captives.
In response to European bluffness, yeah. It's a specific graphic description from that particular source, presented as such.
Later on, though, things shifted towards more regular friendship and commerce, boosted by sugar planting.
Yes, that seems to be the trajectory. Christian missionaries started work on Viti Levu.
And traders, planters, turning Fiji into a sugar colony.
The sources describe them as leviathans, greedy for fast returns, rushing in.
Levuka became prominent for a time.
Until something called Dega reached there, the source notes.
And Wiley gives that anecdote about Kingai Sela resisting the white man's lust of gold.
For 15 years, starting in 1862, yes, a specific instance of resistance highlighted in that text.
Okay, so all this increasing European involvement, it leads straight into the colonial era proper, Fiji formally under the British crown.
Right, the pivotal moment, October 24th, 1874, the cession agreement between the Takai regime and the British.
And the deal was basically Britain controls internal affairs, military gets land rights.
In exchange for political and military protection, other guarantees. That was the core exchange described.
And Britain could appoint an administrator, the lieutenant governor.
Yes, described in one source as acting like pro-fiduciaries, and land got divided up strategically.
Native Fijian lands became crown lands, other areas freehold, according to D. Johnson.
Correct. And technically, the sources point out, the colonial admin put no legal limits on the existing chieftain structures. De jure, they were still authorities.
But de facto, the British held the real power.
Exactly. Absolute practical authority.
That assembly of 1876, under foreign oversight, only 12 elected colonials initially, caused instability.
Yes. The governor trying to consolidate legal authority seems to have backfired a bit.
Then they tried appointing Fijians to the council in 1882.
An attempt was made. But D. Johnson's source observes that, well, Fijians generally didn't seem to grasp its purpose.
So they didn't really attend or participate consistently?
That's the observation in that source, yeah.
Leading to a situation by the 1890s where indigenous people felt isolated.
Entirely lonely in the affairs of Fiji, is how one source puts it. Traditional ways buried.
Taukai scholarship replaced by European literacy, religion.
And one source suggests insufficient distribution of goods put them out of complexity with the ruler's economic plans.
The introduction of other groups, Chinese, Europeans, Indians, stirred jealousy, alienation.
Is noted as doing so, yeah. Especially regarding the idea of a potential indigenously held white-maned government. A striking phrase from one source about power dynamics.
But interestingly, despite all this, one source argues colonization ultimately led to more representation for Taukais through complex reforms.
That counterintuitive argument is presented, yes.
And D. Johnson explores these what-ifs. What if Britain hadn't withdrawn?
Right. One view. Continued submission for indigenous Fijians and insignificant existence.
The counter-argument?
Absolute power would have stayed with indigenous Fijians, but colonizers might have used bare brutality for resource extraction, with no foreign oversight to challenge things. Hypotheticals, but interesting ones raised.
Leclerc-Caffarel adds more context. Confirms the session date, October 10th, 1874, sees it partly as a peace treaty.
Yeah, put it in the context of the Pacific becoming more important to Europe strategically, economically.
Britain seeking stability where tensions threatened it.
Exactly. Their actions aimed to create a framework for colonial rule.
And the political landscape before annexation, it was fragmented. Small independent polities.
Led by chiefs, yeah. Tui Viti and Bao is mentioned. But the colonial narrative often oversimplified this.
Portraying them as just tribal kingdoms with malignant and cruel kings.
Leclerc-Gaffarel critiques that view strongly, argues it missed the complexity. Lay leaders, advisors, intense clan competition, recognition of other chiefs' independence.
It wasn't just one chiefdom running everything.
Far from it.
And the forces leading to cession. It wasn't just the high chiefs agreeing.
Well, they did cede Fiji. One source uses the phrase, buy on demand, by high chiefs.
But the wider international context compelled, negotiated, and pressured the outcome.
That's Leclerc-Gaffarel's argument. Fiji became politically significant in the 1850s, 60s, a pawn between Britain and France.
So the British scheme was to create this inter-chiefdom group to support and control.
Leading to the Kingatonga Federation in 1855 meant as a step to kingship. Later disbanded, reconfigured.
So the conclusion from that source is Fiji's colonial history is more complex than usually thought. Elites navigating tensions.
Yeah, using popular political actions sometimes, exposing collusion, reclaiming power. It's nuanced.
And a huge part of the colonial economy was the indentured labor system, Gurmit.
Right. Sources note its success elsewhere. Mauritius, British Guiana, Trinidad.
And in Fiji, it was driven by sugar. Need for cheap labor on large land tracts.
Exactly. Sources mention labor coming from South India, Reunion, Mauritius, Bourbon Islands, according to D. Johnson.
Because the economy was shifting away from things like sandalwood.
Yeah, that easily exploited virgin wealth was running out. Governor Gordon decided to focus on sustainable agriculture.
Specifically sugar seen as key to the great wealth of the British Empire.
Right. Fiji's land, soil, climate were seen as having huge untapped potential for it. Unexploited infancy.
And a key decision was Gordon approving a monopoly for the Australian firm CSRC.
In May, yes. That was final act mentioned during his governorship related to this.
Johnson's text includes that quote from a Fijian poet and a European observer reflecting on the white man's arrival.
Potential sadness, but also describing Fijians as not a people to be trifled with, sensible and proud, beginning to learn his power.
But a different sort of power linked to indenture.
Exactly. A complex reflection from the source.
Okay, so all of this colonial history, it builds towards self-governance, independence.
Right. Political parties were looking ahead, anticipating October 1970 as the date.
And D. Johnson's source says independence was achieved successfully.
That's the assessment there.
Yeah.
And naturally, planning was needed. Developmental plans before and after.
The sources describe the expected government structure. 4 types of representatives electing most councillors.
White, Fijian, Indian, other. Electing 32 of 36 councillors by universal adult suffrage. Plus reserve seats, special councils for Suva, the railway.
And these councils, established by regulation, 5 councillors usually.
1 European elected by an electoral college, 4 others elected, expected to be influenced by the executive government, which had search powers.
The Executive Council, led by a princely minister. Legislative Council, elected by representatives under a new British Constitution.
That was the plan outlined.
But perspectives on independence differed.
Significantly, the Federation movement saw it as moving forward towards an independent Fiji.
While the Alliance Party saw it more as consolidating power. Fijian-controlled government. No British oversight.
That's the contrast drawn in the sources, yes.
And a big concern was the communal division. Fijian Indian leaders saw it as an obstacle.
They recognize it, yes. An obstacle to consolidating power via independence.
One source suggests a fragile harmony just covered tensions long enough to get independence through on October 10th, 1970.
That's the suggestion. A quick push while tensions were temporarily papered over.
But winning independence, it didn't just magically fix those tensions, did it?
Not according to the sources. The multicultural makeup continued to be a source of friction.
A tendency is noted, Fijians seeking political solutions for economic problems, seen elsewhere too.
That pattern is observed, yes. And post-independence, you see political maneuvering, constitutional changes sometimes going against tradition.
National Party conferences became a regular thing, annual forums.
Yeah, for discussion, dissecting policies, trying to reconcile differences.
But the sources add a warning. These forums could actually reinforce divisions.
Potentially, yes. Bringing groups together with a vengeful pecuniary and a strident political agenda that may demarcate them from us. That's a direct quote highlighting the risk.
The political process itself, slowly becoming less tribalist, but maybe reversible. The late 80s were a litmus test.
That's how it's framed. A critical period.
And ethnic tensions?
Yeah.
Maybe managed during colonial times, but built up covertly.
And that exploded into violence around independence as groups vied for control, a dynamic presented as continuing even now.
There was a period, though, over a decade, where migrant workers lived somewhat separately, ethnically, economically.
In relative isolation from chiefly powers and political patronage, yes, a sort of dormancy.
But power shifted from the governor to a legislative council dominated by chiefs.
A structure that had been in place for about 50 years meant to encourage political development.
But integrating immigrants was seen as necessary for real progress,
Right.
which threatened the old order.
Exactly. A key tension.
Then you have the emergence of new, educated generations, Fijians and Indians.
Right. Meaning fundamental issues, the food bowl, as one source puts it, had to be dealt with. Immigration settlement reevaluated.
And this new generation, their vision was seen as startling and new, but also a threat.
Yeah, fears that bureaucrats would intrude on patronage, Fijians might become second-class citizens with loyalty shifting.
One source sums it up starkly. As blood was shed for nation and control, the contemporary political landscape of Fiji was forged.
Underscores the conflict in that period.
And this post-independence era is really marked by coups d'états, mentioned throughout the source.
Multiple coups, yes. The first election after the 1987 coups was May 1992. Vilal calls it a politically explosive achievement. Briefly offered hope.
But there were major problems. Held under a constitution rejected by half the population, criticized internationally.
Yes, for racially discriminatory provisions. Eligibility issues weren't resolved. Abiding and recent grievances remained.
The lead up to that 92 election, intense activity, public interest, but mostly restrained, except sporadic fisticuffs.
Generally moderate and civil, according to the source.
But tragically, violence erupted when results came out. 5 dead, many injured.
That's the reported outcome. And indigenous Fijian political solidarity crumbled. A paramount chief feared leaders couldn't control their people.
Stepping back to 1987, Rabuka's coup captured the PM, tore down the constitution, martial law.
Then, just months later, the military status legitimized by its own 1990 constitution.
Which entrenched Fijian electoral hegemony.
Exactly. Favoring indigenous Fijian power, as one source puts it.
Then, May 1997, Rabuka oversees a new constitution, due to pressure.
Domestic and international pressure, yeah. The source says he criticized earlier regimes then, aimed for a fairer power balance between Fijians and Indo-Fijians.
Leading to the 1999 election, historic win for Mahendra Chaudhry, first Indo-Fijian PM.
A landmark moment, yes. Fiji Labour Party victory.
But it didn't last long. May 2000, another coup. Chaudhry deposed.
Reportedly masterminded by a disgruntled former MP from his own party.
Leading to another year of crisis, violence, political order overturned again.
A new president, U.S. citizen Donu Narayan, dissolved parliament, enshrined a constitution, enacted by 2 previous military regimes.
Appointed a military officer as his commando. Presidency status enshrined later.
That's the sequence of events described. Very turbulent.
Then another constitution in 2013 supplanted the previous one.
Yes, and Kant notes copies were given to very few opposition members.
Kant's source contrasts this with the successful Bougainville peace process, saying Fiji's outcome was different.
Yes, suggesting a new presidency systematically bulldozed over constitutional life.
And Nolet's source points to a shift in policymakers' focus after the 2006 coup.
From traditional leaders' needs to protecting their political status, linked to indigenization after decrees were reinstated.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. How do people actually make a living in Fiji? Economic development in the sources.
Right. By the 70s, 80s, you see this dual economic structure emerging.
Modern export-focused sugar sector on one side.
And smaller-scale subsistence activities on the other.
Sugar industry. Clearly a huge player historically, dominated by one firm.
Handling most raw material, milling capacity, controlling local distribution, processing. Yeah, long dominated.
The period, 1973-87, high, stable sugar prices, access to a guaranteed European market.
Yes, the one source, Harun Akram Lodi, suggests even that market promised much, but maybe underdelivered.
Fiji guaranteed supply up to 180,000 tons, but exported only a small fraction at unsugar prices.
Around 2.5% exported at those lower prices, according to that source.
And the politics behind this dualism? Akram Lodi describes a short Melanesian sugar hegemonic oligarchy.
Running on capitalist principles, but exploited by a world sugar barocco. Very vivid phrasing, suggesting a complex global dynamic.
And the small landowners, cultivators, barely compensated.
That's the description used for their situation.
The educated elite from Kailoma Rotuma groups, underrepresented in this oligarchy.
Noted as such, Europeans and more educated Indians seen as targets of manipulation, forming instrumental voluntary institutions more effectively.
And an unintended consequence: delinquency of a broad mass of indebted farmers.
Highlighting widespread economic struggle, Happened without conscious design, the source said.
Okay, what about tourism? Huge part of the image, right?
Absolutely. The sources consistently mention the appeal. Stunning islands, clear water, beaches, mountains, diversity, over 300 islands, volcanic, coral.
Cultivated this reputation as an idyllic paradise, a haven.
Yeah, and one source explicitly says, little of Fiji's difficult history has marred its idyllic reputation. The image often separate from the politics.
We get stats. Nearly 70% of visitors on holiday seeking a wholly new experience.
That's how it's characterized. It arrived relatively late 50s with air services. First hotels followed.
Benefits included financing infrastructure, introducing better construction standards.
Helped with that, protecting against cyclones, flooding. The Fiji Tourist Bureau started in the 60s, pushed aggressive campaigns.
And the growth was rapid. From 12,000 tourists in 1970
to almost 198,000 by 1980, soon passing 200,000. Huge jump.
Fueling more infrastructure, access to outer islands, transport, overtook the Cook Islands as the biggest market.
Became the largest in the South Pacific, yes.
But performance wasn't always smooth, punctuated by periods of difficulty. Lost momentum recently.
That's noted too. The idyllic reputation remains, but the future is seen as uncertain, tied to security, survival.
The 1987 coup hit tourism hard.
Dire impact. Dire fears is the phrase used. Airlines pulled packages, certain tourists stopped coming, hotel occupancy plummeted to about 20%.
Numbers dropped dramatically in '88.
By 38,000, a major blow.
But it recovered, helped by aggressive campaigns from regional tourism offices.
Yes, recovery gathered steam into the mid-90s. Numbers rose, record cruise yacht arrivals.
But then entered a tougher era around 1995, struggling to regain momentum.
That's the assessment. And the 2000 instability, the coup. Heavily armed rebels at Parliament took another big toll.
Cruise ships, yachts canceled. Airlines faced cancellations, empty seats, huge losses.
Estimated around $18 million a month just for accommodation. Tourism offices mobilized again to fight the perception crisis.
Okay, besides tourism, agriculture and exports are still fundamental.
Predominantly agricultural country, sources say. Sugar, copra, tourism driving over 60% of national income from value-added exports.
But diversification is noted. Most diversified in the South Pacific, according to Hasler et al.
Produces fruits, vegetables, green tea, tobacco, flowers too.
Output comes from big estates, but also lots of smallholders.
Bulk from a few estates, sugar, copra, but a wide variety of smallholders grow other export crops.
B. Wiley's 1923 source compared Fiji and Hawaii agriculture. Similarities, but big differences.
Right. Both tropical, similar methods, controlled by few groups, similar world prices.
But Fiji, much more diversified, cultivated way more land area, more major crops.
30–40% land cultivated versus 10% in Hawaii. Dozen major crops versus just 3. Livestock not important in Fiji, but is in Hawaii.
And irrigation needed in Hawaii, but Fiji sugar is rain-fed.
Correct. Quality-quantity recovery slightly lower in Fiji at that time, though.
Other economic activities mentioned by Akram Lodi, agriculture fishery related, tuna re-exports.
Significant, yes. Sugar reiterated as the mainstay, nearly half total exports, 10% GDP, over 40% export earnings. Growers and mills.
Other agriculture industries, kava, ginger, coconut oil.
Coconut milk processing, too. Ginger and fisheries showed phenomenal growth rates, 1992-96.
Gold mining is mentioned, largest mineral exporter, recent addition.
Yes. Fiji also has intermediate copper deposits, but they're deep, low grade.
Manufacturing sector, small, subordinate importance.
Estimated $245 million, 8% GDP in 97. Limited development 1970-87, based on import substitution.
And state-owned enterprises post-independence. Made soft drinks, chicken, Subsidiaries like a foundry.
Carton factory too, yeah.
Yeah.
And infrastructure establishments later on.
All right, let's shift focus to identity and expression. Cultural heritage, described as phenomenal, older than many nations.
That's the description. And a common saying mentioned. To understand Fiji, understand its people and culture. So much history comes from cultural development.
And traditional practices are still visible. Dancers performing legends, festivities in villages.
Dances, singing, communal food prep, yeah. Plus customs like palm frond weaving, floral crafting influenced by the climate, plants.
Culture is also seen through architecture, indigenous village layouts versus colonial structures.
That contrast is drawn. And post-independence constructions installations, bridges also impact how heritage is seen today, according to Leclerc-Farrell.
But there's a challenge noted. Globalization, population movement leading to traditions disappearing or changing.
A significant concern raised in the sources, yes.
And Fijian artifacts, many collected, especially 19th century, now scattered worldwide.
In museums, private collections, often rarely exhibited, some uncatalogued.
Leclerc-Farrell includes a call to action from the source, urgent for Fijians to reclaim heritage for analysis.
Yeah, to understand it as intended by the producers. Best way suggested. Study the artifacts, how are made, their meanings.
Okay, returning to traditional practices. The sources place Fiji geographically again. Pacific, halfway between equator's southern tropic.
Near the midpoint of that NZ, Hawaii Easter Island Triangle. Land area, 18,300 kilometers long coastline, large underwater platform. Local perception, dense group, few large islands, low coral atolls around.
British exploration sparked by Cook, 1774-75. Then more European interest intensified.
Traders, missionaries, planters arriving, according to Crisetto.
Leading to this period of adventure, intrigue, acquisition of land. From Fijians described quite harshly in one source.
As fickle and sometimes downright treacherous, yes. That's the language used there. And these events remembered as great heists.
Colonial Fiji starts 1874, a dramatic turning point, watershed.
For indigenous people, definitely. Under British rule, this source says, Fijians were removed from history, seen as subservient.
By British and even Gold Coast natives brought in. Lost past, land power, under British guns.
That's the stark portrayal in that source from 1874 onwards.
Those who gained favor were dubbed as chiefs by the British, gain authority from the new system.
And the traditional chiefly system transformed into a modern, obsolescent, hapless bureaucracy, an alteration of Fiji.
By the late 20th century, a growing indigenous cyclone, a new educated middle class.
Often theology-based high school grads, yeah. Agitated by political church leaders, linked with low-paid public servants, sugar workers.
Gathering power under the shadow of antiquated chiefly system.
Right, and their rallying cry.
The lands for the Fijians, invoking ancestral power.
Resorting to ancestors' language, images like Fauva, songs recited colonial history invoked bitterness.
Now, modern influences. Nullet notes that before missionaries in 1835, influence was exclusively Polynesian.
That's the point made.
The biggest initial missionary impact was agricultural change. Cotton, sugarcane for markets.
America, Australia, UK, effects still visible.
Yeah.
Some land reserves still controlled by non-indigenous groups.
Missionary influence on formal political structures felt after arrival, especially in Bao.
Yes, and their strategy wasn't just converting individuals.
They targeted chiefs, used the chiefs' new Christian knowledge against rivals.
To exert ideological control. Exactly.
And they didn't adapt Fijian rituals, they substituted them. Different creed, chapel, priests.
Total substitution. The source says the ideological battle was won. A chief with a chapel was endowed. It was a symbol of success.
Though mastery could be incomplete if rivals held on to traditional symbols.
Right, contested ornaments.
And since then, this idea of chiefly formality, anything informal, criminalized, or seen as demonic.
Tomata, humankind in the informal sense, yeah. Fleeing conventional order.
Leclerc-Farrell adds sentiments like envy, disbelief towards ideas deviating from arithmetic, questioning Western logic.
A sense of cultural clash and understanding, yeah.
Yeah.
Input, recursion, output logic, questioned.
Leading to waves of religious dissension, religious wars, 1865-1875.
Yes. Chiefs like Ma'afu and Lau, resorting to protecting traditional gods, believed to withstand fire, artillery.
A pan-Fijian crusade assembled near Bao, the missionary base, site of plantations.
That confrontation is described, yes.
Let's move to another critical area, environmental issues. The core point seems to be insufficient attention, despite recognition in the '97 Constitution.
That's the headline issue raised. environmental degradation hasn't gotten the focus needed.
Wetlands, mangroves particularly affected, used for development but blighted by inappropriate legislation and/or lack of enforcement.
Exactly. Overexploitation of coastal resources to sand, coral, poorly planned ports, marinas.
Resulting in destructive activities like coral mining going unchecked.
Seems so. And poorly formulated policies continue to harm the environment.
Memora and none note governments are often reluctant to share information on these issues.
That reluctance is highlighted, yes. Makes tackling the problems harder.
Deforestation reached debilitating levels, but campaigners are hamstrung.
Finding it hard to get documentation, timely info on blockages to better governance.
So there's this tension. Ideals of sustainable development versus the reality of overexploitation.
Leading to major ecosystem damage, biodiversity loss, specific threats listed, mammal invasions, rapid ag expansion, forest exploitation, bad logging.
Aquatic ecosystems suffering too. Wetlands, streams, reefs, from pollution, sedimentation, invasives.
All mentioned. And coastal ecosystems weakened by poor beachfront development, leading to unprecedented erosion rates.
It sounds like even environmental professionals face challenges.
Planners, engineers often can't address issues due to historical noncompliance with policies like EIAs.
Coastal managers rendered impotent due to conflicts of interest, lack of understanding.
Severe conflicts, yeah, especially with local authorities' own proposals, and maybe not fully grasping the limits of engineering solutions.
Environmental education, recognized as important, but little progress. Lack of resources, skills, ideological will.
That's the assessment given.
The sources also discuss climate change impact, focusing on view.
Temperature, sunshine, rainfall observations. Baseline climate for Natasuva, recent trends.
Reiterating the basics. Viti size, mountains creating wet east, dry west. Temp around 25 C, rainfall higher in Suva.
Tropical maritime climate confirmed again. Average rainfall 2,500 millimeters over 100 years. Southeast trades dominant, influencing weather patterns along with troughs. Two distinct seasons, wet and dry.
What about conservation efforts? The sources discuss historical impacts of introduced species.
Yeah, provides info on pre-human flora roughly equal endemic and non-endemic plants.
But by 2008, significant changes reported gained 30 naturalized species.
But at least 186 indigenous species extinct, nearly all due to human activity. A shocking number.
Main threats today, according to the sources, invasive species, habitat conversion.
And specific examples are given. Domestic pigs, mid-19th century, destroyed 80% lowland forest on Viti Levu in just 2 decades.
Devastating impact. Loss of large trees, altered smaller ones, changed flowering patterns.
Red deer, late 19th century, overgrazed the understory of remaining lowland rainforests.
Invasive rodents, mid-20th century, wiped out ground-low nesting birds on islands like Rotuma.
With their predators, yeah. Extirpated them. And 12 harmful invasive plants reduced tree species generations dramatically.
Giant guinea grass converted lowland wet forest to fire-prone grassland, increased erosion, flooding.
On Viti Levu, yes. And animal-vegetable farming in montane rainforests. Dramatically increased erosion, reduced sediment deposition.
Even agroforest impacts are noted. Plantation coconut palms convert reefs to mudbanks.
Covering 15% land area. And smallholder sugarcane, though less area, has a larger negative impact per area. Lowland wet cultivation wetlands called irreplaceable.
Okay, placing Fiji on the world stage again. Location, north of NZ, east of Australia, 600 islands, 100 inhabited. Area around 18,308 square miles.
B. Wiley's 1923 source describes the geography again, connecting plateaus, volcanic islands standing out, the archipelago in a giant crater. Outer islands, remnants of the rim.
A curious phenomenon widespread in the Pacific, linked to the dateline.
Fiji's advantages over Samoa Tonga reiterated from that source. Climate, land, production diversity, mountains.
Flora-fauna more distinct from NZ. Inferior only to Samoa, maybe. Offers a great study opportunity for tourists.
Because it's accessible, well-preserved, diverse. The distinctions explained by flora-fauna being opposed to ocean currents.
International relations in the 19th century? Fiji facing foreign intervention, annexation, driven by economic ambitions.
Subject to manipulation, conspiracy, treason involving Vanuatu chiefs and paramount chiefs, according to Nolet.
British annexation, 1874, understood as governing like a protectorate, similar to Tonga.
But the source says Vanuatu chiefs, headmen, British subjects all fell prey to the planning and manipulations of colonial administrators.
The exchange described. British-associated Vanuatu chiefs indirectly installed as officers for land native policy, receiving powers based on the Polynesian Code.
That's Nollet's description of the indirect rule setup.
Then the 1882 Council of Chiefs, appointed as a lower house, recognizing chiefly hierarchy.
Yes, but under direct British rule, old laws revived to punish the Vainu Shatter Council, favored chiefly kids sent to Suva schools.
While the upper house, the European aristocracy, interpreted and diminished chiefly powers.
Acted as political advisors but reduced their authority.
One source, Leclerc Caffarel, gives specific incidents. 1874, Chief Kakobau signing a bouquet to Governor Thurston, allegedly containing remnants of Vainua Council authority, taxes.
Presented as a family offering but contained these elements. And a Delect 1874 report mentions Kakobau sending brigands and raiders. Gun battle. Presented as treason, but with prior notice.
Select chiefs attended meetings in fear of imprisonment for ransom.
Paints a picture of coercion, yeah.
And that really dramatic incident, the climax, October 28, 1880, infernal meetings, pointed questions to Chief Tavanavana.
About not convening a Keys meeting, he protested ignorance, denied impersonating chiefs, considered the question disreputable.
And then, shocking detail, he was forcibly seized and bound neck to tummy with a thick rope and thrown before a horse on MacDonald's order.
A truly graphic account presented directly from that specific source. Stark illustration of the power dynamics.
Pressure from these proquisitions led to protests and fathered faithful political institutions for self-determination. Lower house, trying to protect its limited powers.
That's the interpretation given.
Another incident in December, a Rabuka transfer of officers dispersed unprovoked. Police arresting natives unconditionally, smashing into corrals, summoning chiefs to Suva.
More examples of heavy-handed colonial actions from Leclerc Caffarel.
Moving to Fiji's role in global organizations today, recent events like regaining a UN committee seat, PM indicating climate neutrality efforts.
Yes, active on the world stage. Long list of memberships. UN since 1970, WTO observer, applied for membership. PIF member since '89.
Bilateral relations with Pacific states, though ties with ENS Australia sometimes soured.
Noted as having ups and downs, founding member of South Pacific Forum, SBREP, hosted meetings, leadership in regional cricket.
Commonwealth involvement strengthened. Asia-Pacific Telecommunity founding member.
Active in regional co-op, too. Fisheries Agency, Punta del Este Group.
Other memberships listed. Non-aligned movement, G77, G15, G20. Various meetings, conferences.
The point is, Fiji's been a member of many international regional orgs since independence. Mostly collaborated, sent delegations, promoted national interests.
Okay, let's bring it to the present day. Contemporary Fiji. The sources summarize the post-independence period as, well, tumultuous. Political instability, ethnic turmoil, according to Kant.
That's the summary provided, yes. Turbulent times. Kant's source revisits key political events again.
May 14th, 1987. Rabuka coup. Capture PM, tore down constitution, martial law.
4 months later, military status legitimized by its own 1990 constitution, entrenching Fijian electoral hegemony.
May 1997. Rabuka oversees new constitution under pressure, criticizing earlier regimes, aiming for fairer power balance.
1999 election. Historic victory, Indo-Fijian PM Mahendra Chaudhry.
May 2000. Chaudhry deposed in another coup, masterminded by disgruntled former MP.
Year of crisis violence. Political order overturned again. New President Donu Narayan disbands parliament, enshrines constitution from 2 military regimes, appoints military commando. Presidency status enshrined later.
A few years later, 2013, new constitution supplants previous, copies to few opposition.
Right. And Kant's source contrasts this with Bougainville's successful peace process, suggesting Fiji's presidency systematically bulldozed over constitutional life.
Now let's critique again. Focus shift after coups, including 2006. From traditional leaders' needs to protecting political status, linked to indigenization after decree reinstatement.
A critical perspective on policymakers' priorities.
The current political landscape, described by Lala and Crescetto as parliamentary democracy, president, head of state, PM, head of government, elected parliament.
Yes, with the Karanavalu Ratu Ovini Bukininukabulu as a principal advisory body to the president.
Electoral method. Modified preferential, alternative vote, first used 1999. Independent Electoral Commission.
Parliament composition. 56 members. 27 general electorate. 29 indigenous Fijian and other electorate. Sources note non-Fijians given token level of representation.
The 1997 Constitution amended the last one, result of negotiations. Ratified by incumbent government.
But sources say it did not eliminate iniquitous provisions of the previous one. Indigenous Fijian numbers in parliament intended to be more than the combined total for others, according to Lal.
Key figures mentioned for this period: Ratu Serkamizes Mara, first and longest-serving PM.
Remembered for independence, 1970, and the 1997 Constitution after post-87 instability. Retired, 2001.
His successor, Lasenia Kuraz, elected 87, deputy PM under Rabuka, became PM after Rabuka resigned 2000. Formed coalition government.
Yes, though Crescendo notes some coalition partners were fringe parties, credibility questioned.
Mahendra Chaudhry highlighted again as first Indo-Fijian PM, 1999, leader of opposition FLP.
And Rabuka resigned as PM party leader in 2000. Party landscape until then. Mostly Fijian-dominated, opposition led by FLP.
Social developments. Political history called perplexing. Curious leaps and twists.
That's the description. Early 90s spotlight from the 92 election. Coup catapulted Fiji into view. Media compared it to genocide and legislative abuse.
But Vilal critiques that coverage, saying they often banalize the racial scapegoating of Indo-Fijians and the widespread violence against them, politicizing a tragedy.
Presents that as the source's viewpoint on the media portrayal, yes.
The 1990 Constitution recognized indigenous elite fears of decolonization, created buffer against Indo-Fijian resurgence, placed power with chiefs.
Described as placing total political power and control in the hands of indigenous tribal chiefs, with the narrative of both races bound by social contracts.
The siege mentality shattered by the 92 election, dubbed frenetic frontier democracy, Fiji's second independence.
Celebrated, mourned, endorsed as such.
But the aftermath, 8 months later, election clash of ideologies gave way to fractious parliamentary discussions.
Privilege usage mired in suspensions, threats, ugly verbal abuse. Factions clamored riotously over land and race.
Gradual exclusion of rival opposition, executive freedoms not universally applied, social discord infecting local politics, past decades spent thrice in the debilitating shadows of coup and dictatorship.
A grim assessment from the sources.
1999 election again. Fiji's second government arising from ruins of the 87 coup against the first.
And the paradox mentioned regarding the 2000 coup? Populist campaign against government morphed into coup against independence, won without a fight.
Fueled by racial reaction against nationalism, lapsed under nuclear shadow, tasered Fiji's tripartite ethnic paradigm, pitted vanilla against chocolate, for right of Fiji's original people.
Really striking critical phrases used in the source to describe those events and motivations.
And finally, circling back to key figures in the earlier independence movement from Section 6.2, leaders in Land Claims Commission.
Junior Kakabo, La Matakali officer. Kamuta Latinara Palikoro. Father Kevin O'Shea, priest critic to financial elite.
People using nonviolent protest. Abner Aliti contesting election against NFP.
First Fijian to do so. Nivis Lau, Anglican worker, initiating court proceedings after failing to gain council seat. First Fijian to do that.
Mrs. Gandhi's India Eagle Plan, mentioned as making Fijian unity imperative.
Plans developed to counteract predatory vultures obsessed with the gospel of mammon, seen as trying to smooth-talk Fijians and control elections.
Context. Anti-Fijian riots during visits, conferences.
Yes, Lakala Beach, Bua mentioned.
Reaching a climax in 1994, rugger teams, church groups, 100,000 farmers blockading parliament with sugarcane.
Kilakali, Oeda teams, Bodolavu, Umonek church groups from Naitasiri. Yeah, quite the scene described.
Meeting practices described, starting with prayers. Reprimands for involvement in abusive land development, different prayer styles reflecting internal divisions.
Those ashamed prayed Indo-Fijian manner. Resistors prayed in tongues without intercessors. Fascinating detail.
A no vote signified belief in right to develop land, defiance against hindrance.
That's how it's interpreted. The aftermath involved evidence against leaders, reliance on experts gone wrong, proclamations deemed foolish, complaints against lawyers, magistrates, enterprise debt ridiculed, ordinance to lower prices failed, public punishment idea dropped, Fijians hushed with threats of sackings, nonviolent protest lawsuits promoted by a few. Paints a detailed, complex picture of the internal dynamics and struggles within that movement.
Okay, let's wrap this up by looking ahead. Future prospects for Fiji, as the sources see them. Economic outlook broken down.
Yeah, into categories. Tourism, agriculture, agribusiness, mining, quarrying, forestry, manufacturing.
Tourism projection. Successful expansion due to tech. Visitor base reaching 4 million arrivals by 2033. including 1 million cruise passengers.
That's the projection given, but notably doesn't include average tourist spend.
Expected impact: nearly $3 billion rise in gross tourism earnings, affecting accommodation, services, all sectors benefit.
That's the optimistic outlook presented.
Agriculture, agribusiness also positive. Very profitable due to Fijian deliciously expended food abilities. And demand in Asas and Z.
Trampling population for food is the phrase used for demand. Strong export market potential seen.
Though prediction is hard, many factors influenced by outside Fiji's belief that profitable food exporting era will start soon.
Yeah, rationale is land loss due to improper human operation. Time for Fijians to find search home foods again to harvest.
Mining quarrying potential. Opening new, large quarries in considerable stages. Finding new sources.
Means values added in Fijians' wealth, employment, high persuade levels, expanding businesses, big families mentioned as potential labor.
Reactivating old closed quarries also valuable, if using new, cheaper, variously advanced, more profitable processes.
Recognizing they closed due to economic viability issues before.
Forestry industry. Sustainable soft bamboo, sustainable trees for building.
Manufacturing examples. High level needed. Silk fiber bamboo for transmitting and refreshing walls, ropes, carpets, coarse bamboo for houses, bridges, water conservation. Interesting specific applications mentioned there.
The economic outlook from Akram Lodi summarized again. Dual economy, sugar, tourism dominates. Other activities. Egg-related, fishery-related, tuna re-exports.
Sugar restated as mainstay. 48.9% exports, 1.4% labor, 10% GDP, 40% export earnings, growers, mills.
Tourism briefly reigned as South Pacific capital. Earnings 41% total export earnings after remittances, 20% GDP, 30% labor force, 16,000 direct jobs.
Other resource activity. Forestry. Timber processing, small, veneer, plywood, furniture. Other ag industries. Kava, ginger, coconut oil milk. Phenomenal growth for ginger fisheries, 92-96.
Gold mining, largest mineral exporter. Recent intermediate copper deposits, deep, low grade. Manufacturing, small, subordinate. 245 meters, 8% GDP, 97. Limited dev, 70-87, based on import substitution. State enterprises made goods, had subsidiaries, built infrastructure.
So a recap of the economic pillars and potential growth areas.
Sustainable development is a key theme woven through this. Picturesque islands, rich cultural traditions, Melanesian-Polynesian mix.
Customs. Tribal ceremonies, dances, music, arts, crafts, cooking, modern festivals too. New calendar promoting culture to visitors.
Ratamatavuki describes the feeling of the islands. Peace, tranquility, friendliness, hospitality, laid-back lifestyle.
Yeah, that sense of place.
And this balance noted, respect for old customs complemented by new skills attitudes from modernization. Balancing tradition-modernity is the mainstay of Fiji's social infrastructure.
That's presented as crucial.
Connecting back to sustainable development, Mamura and Nunn note intensified pressure, often used without common understanding.
The general definition provided. Meet present needs without compromising the future. Maintain ecological processes, conserve diversity, sustainable resource use via environmental protection.
But in the tropical context, economic growth often seen as the fix, but environmental issues show the high price.
Yeah, Fiji's fragile ecosystems, reefs, lakes, forests degrading rapidly, need for a new paradigm beyond current global economic orthodoxy. Sustainable development offers this. That's the potential path forward suggested by the sources.
Right. As we bring this deep dive to a close, the sources reflect, mentioning a 50th anniversary, a time to mark continuity, celebrate tradition, take stock.
Yes, and stating the aim of reflecting on this history is, above all, an attempt to explain to outsiders the sometimes incomprehensible passions and conflicts which have plagued the younger generations of this independent island nation.
Fiji's society described as uniquely plural, mix of Polynesian-Melanesian settlers forming Aitake identity, and various migrant Indian communities, sometimes grouped as Hindu Gurmitia.
And the role of non-Fijians acknowledged, instrumental in wealth economic development, but their presence created endemic tensions with and within the indigenous communities.
Recent inter-ethnic conflict noted as quite predominantly erupted between Fijians and Indo-Fijians, according to Don Tamuki.
One source ends with a call for non-Fijian engagement, understanding. Hope that a wider audience builds on historians' work.
Poignant detail about lost papers of earlier settlers. Futilely candid insights. Independent settler historians provided extraordinarily useful foundational research, even if motives sometimes differed.
Sadly, much rumored lost amongst the dust of old European homes.
Some foresaw the challenges. Nationhood, nationalism, colonialism. But tragically, scorned the unappreciated islanders' shared cultural heritage.
A missed opportunity noted there.
And a call to action for new historians, a generation on, to rise to this challenge. Fiji's first settler historians deserve to be published.
Yes, valuing that early work.
The propitious question they raised: did the first settlers discover a country? The source answers simply, much was lost.
Sobering thought.
And the sources leave us with this powerful final idea. The foreshadowed confrontation may be glossed over by earlier historians, but something native colonial histories must grapple with. It had already begun long ago and rapidly intensified. Wow. That really was a deep dive, wasn't it? We've covered centuries. History, culture, economics, environment, all straight from that stack of sources you provided.
Yeah, we've tried to navigate through the complex social dynamics, the political upheavals, that fundamental relationship between people, land, and outside forces.
Aiming to give you the key insights just as they're presented in those documents.
Exactly. No external interpretation, just what the sources laid out.
So what's the lasting thought to maybe take away from all this? For me, perhaps it's that final point, that long-standing confrontation stemming from Fiji's uniquely plural society, its intertwined native and colonial histories, a challenge that, according to these sources, continues to shape the nation.
And demands that ongoing understanding and grappling mentioned right at the end. It's certainly not simple.
Definitely not. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Fiji.
Thank you.